Welcome to Internet Misfits, a podcast that explores new, exciting futures and the people building them. We focus on creators and entrepreneurs who see the world differently. I'm Joe Cohen, your host and the founder and CEO of Universe, an app that lets anyone build an amazing website and online store with just their phone. In this podcast, I try to get at the essence of our guests' unique ways of seeing the world and understand really what makes them tick. My hope is that you leave with new learnings, tools, and inspiration to build out your own dreams. Let's dive in. Today, we've got Abe Burmeister on the podcast. Abe, I'm so happy you're here. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
So Abe is the founder of one of my favorite brands. It's a company called Outlier. They are I would say, avant-garde / like just techwear brand that I've been following for probably a decade and have been really pushing the envelope on what really the future of apparel and gear is like. I'm really pioneers in the whole techwear movement, but I've been a fan and a customer for a while. I've gotten to know Abe a little bit over the years. I'm stoked to have you here, Abe.
Yeah. Oh, excited to be here and talk. I know we're going to talk tech, right?
We'll talk everything.
All right, cool.
So how are things going?
Well, I mean, the world's crazy as always. You know, right now it's like we're in this middle like bank crisis thing, right? So we know that. So I'm trying to wrap my head around that because it's interesting. It's like a crisis of confidence in a way, right? You have like, a bank run on Silicon Valley Bank, right? So you have like, founders are generally like pretty cocky people and, they've successfully raised money to get to the founder stage, right? So they've got some level of success behind them. So these are not people that ordinarily just panic, right? And start a bank run. So it's an interesting environment. It's like what sort of circumstances lead these type of people to panic, right? And bank runs are old, right? They're manias and panics, and this is as old as there have been markets. There's been stuff like this, right? So, but it's an interesting sort of psychological grounding. So, trying to make sense of it right now.
I was in the middle of it. We banked with SVB.
Yeah. Oh wow. Oh god.
And so I have a little bit of an inside experience on it. I hear you on the sort of panic conflicting with the confidence. It seems like on the outside is needed to do a company or for a founder to have. But for me, it was actually pretty familiar. And I think panic is the flip side of hype.
Yeah.
And Silicon Valley runs on hype. And I think that when you connect the natural ethos of like a boom and bust economic cycle with social media and the ability for information to travel and action to be taken so quickly on that information, for example, withdrawing your money, it can have real effects. And I think the bank run was like the latest example of it. But I think we've been doing this in various different formats for the past 5-10 years, and it's only accelerating. So I don't really see it as much of a conflict as just another iteration of its expression.
But I mean, at the same time, it's like, like people think of banks as like this big secure thing, right? We're not like, even though like banks have been failing our whole lives, like, I'm old enough to have been around in the savings and loan crisis and right. But it's like boring, right? You don't even think about it. You just think, oh, your money's in the bank, no problem. So all these founders they thought it was as good as gold, right?
Yeah.
And then they're like, wait, this can just vanish overnight. Like I lent money to the bank. I'm not just storing it there, right? Like that's, there's a ground shift, right? And they bring it back to fashion, which is like my space, right? Like, there's definitely a big like return to, like it's a conservative turn. Like you really see it in these last season shows, and it's been happening for a long time in different ways. But like the shows got like more reserved and quieter and like grayer, right? It was like the luxury brands want to go back to like their core kind of consumer space rather than expansiveness, right? So there's this kind of like overall, I see like kind of like a retreat to the familiar in a lot of spaces, right? But bank is something familiar. It's stable, right? You're like, oh, we're going back to the stable ground, and all of a sudden that stable ground is not as stable as you thought it was. So it's an interesting environment.
Yeah, I mean, to me, what's interesting about that, and I like the connection to fashion, because, it seems like the weirder things get, the more we like retreat to safety.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, of course.
So is that when you think in terms of fashion and that kind of like reservation, do you think that's a reaction to just the craziness of the world?
Definitely. The less, like, when you're really comfortable and you're like a little bored, you're like, I want something new. I want something exciting. I want something that changed my mind a little bit, right? Because you're in a position where you're open to that. And when you're like tired of surprises, because they keep coming and they keep like discombobulating you, right? You want to sit on somewhere warm and cozy and stable and like return to something familiar. And everybody has different zones, people, in fashion, it's interesting. Like people who are in the avant-garde fashion, it's very rare that they're eating like avant-garde food too, right? It's like, it's hard to, I'm sure there's somebody out there who's like going to the craziest restaurants, wearing the craziest clothes, doing the craziest sports or whatever it is, right? Like you can push the extremes in all these dynamics, but most people only do it in certain parameters, right? And then other parts of their lives might be like super conservative, even though if like their outward appearance might be crazy, or their, business practices, or, the code they're writing, whatever it is, right? People can push in certain levels and they have to like have their stable ground as well.
And do you think that's just like for balance?
Yeah, I think it's, if you're in like a full space of relativity, right, you have no fixed point to measure anything off of, like, you're just going to bounce around, right? You need to like have some sort of grounding in order to actually build something, right?
Yeah, that resonates. It's like you can be extreme in certain areas. I mean, otherwise you sort of devolve into chaos, but it's almost hard to even really hit that super high extreme note if you're not, stable in other areas.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm curious, like pulling a thread on fashion, like from your perspective, is it another flavor of conservative? Because I'm not in that world, but I'm in New York. I see it on the street. Like it feels almost like post-conservative or like a postmodern conservative, where it's not, at least from my perspective, like classic Ivy in its original state, but like almost like a twisted version of it. I'm curious how you see it.
In terms of where fashion is now? Or
like when you talk about fashion being in this conservative moment, how much of it is like literal throwback to a previous time versus just, like you said, the forms being more reserved, like, darker tones, less color, things like that?
There's two sort of things. Like there's sort of like a heritage type of conservative, right? Which is somewhat outside of fashion, but although it's there, right? And then there's just like, that's sort of like low risk, like not, trying to reserved like type of fashion, like kind of retreat to the core principles. And you have to remember, when we're talking about fashion, we're in New York, right? We're in Brooklyn, North Brooklyn, right? And this is where things are changing fast, and people who are, there's a giant fashion industry in New York. People are drawn to New York because of it, right? And the periphery around it, right? Like whether it's art or architecture, right? So we have these industries here. And so you're going to see the people who are pushing it the fastest and the most around you. And that's going to influence how even people who aren't in the industry, like because they're surrounded by, they go to a restaurant, they're sitting next to somebody in fashion, right? Or their friend is, right? Like, so it permeates the whole culture. Like I went to school in Southern California, and it was really, really interesting seeing people who came from Southern California. There weren't that many New Yorkers there, right? But like a decent amount of people like came to New York eventually, and like just watching them change how they dress and their perspective as they came to this, it's like, it's very fast. It's like you can't, and part of it's just college versus like the real world. But a lot of it's just like you enter an environment where these aesthetic sort of drives like are propagating, and it affects you, whether you like it or not.
So Abe, I'm curious, navigating this like balance of heritage and sort of avant-garde, Outlier feels to me like really at that balance where like you think about, I would imagine that you think about that more than most. Because, when I first found Outlier in the early 2010s, it was like practical clothing that was made out of strong materials, but it was not like pushing the envelope on fashion. How do you think about that balance?
Yeah, it's interesting because we definitely weren't pushing the envelope on fashion at the time, but I think the key thing that's hard to see, and particularly like visually see, is we're very much about materials and structure. And so like what we were trying to do, I started the project in 2006. We launched in 2008, right? So at that time, the environment was a little different. And so what I was trying to do was like bring this entire world of advanced functionality that really at that time was only in like outdoor world, and like it was barely in the sports world, like the very high performance stuff that like people might actually wear on the field had some of it, but it really like mostly was focused in the outdoor world. And then you have like other crazy industries like firefighters and the military, right? I once looked at a fabric that was designed they made suits for people who clean nuclear reactors, right? It was like, I never found a use for that material, but it was crazy. And it was less like crazy looking than you might think. It was an interesting material. So at that point, the act of like kind of bringing this technology into everyday wear was kind of like, that was the avant-garde act, right? That was the energy. And people don't really realize it because when you step back like, 10 years later and like, what we were doing, and we really were like some of the first to do this stuff. There were predecessors, people who tried, but like we kind of like cracked open the code in a little bit of a way. And so now it's everywhere. You go into Banana Republic or you go get some Dockers, right? There's stuff that we pioneered that's in these materials. So now it seems very, when you look at what we did, like in that context, it seems quite conservative. But the fact is that nobody was putting four-way stretch materials into pants. Nobody was putting water-resistant treatments into these things unless it was like a hardcore hiking garment. And it's interesting. I love the outdoor industry, but they really don't get the aesthetics of you living in New York and like what it means, right? Like they'd all like, there were years and years of precedent of like different outdoor brands being like, let's do a city line. We can expand. Like we're not just outdoors, right? And then they just throw extra random zippers and logos and, things that just like, you just don't want to wear every day, right? So the parameters changed, but like, from my perspective, like we were always trying to push that, that limits. Like, so there was always this avant-garde element to it. It just wasn't visible. It was like a structural avant-garde, a material avant-garde. And that sort of era is over, right? These materials are now like pervasive throughout the industry, right? And so that gives us the ability to play in like in other parameters, right? Aesthetics and shape. And so it opens up the possibility space in certain ways. But it's interesting because a lot of people react to the visual aspect of it, which used to be much more, pared back, and we're expanding and opening that side up a lot.
When I first encountered the brand, the product was like a dungaree, right? But it was done in like a fabric that was water resistant, that didn't smell, that didn't tear. And I switched from jeans, and it was like, it's amazing, right? Because like denim is just there's so many problems with denim. It's uncomfortable, it stains, it rips, and like here you had this thing that was like better in every way. And I hear you, that was like a transgressive thing. It was different in and of itself.
Yeah, totally. Like, I mean, that was in the climate we were doing it and convincing people that that this should exist, right? And we succeeded, which is great. And, we weren't the only ones, but we really were right there at that get-go.
So how did you get to that place?
I was destroying my jeans. It was dead. It's funny, as a kid, I grew up here in New York, and I never rode a bike at all when I was a kid. My parents made me ride 1 mile. They were like, you got to ride a mile on this bicycle. And I did the mile, and I put the thing aside, and I was like, I want to be on the subway. It's way cooler on the subway, right? But this is like an 8-year-old. And, I was in my 20s, and I discovered that biking the city was like super fun.
Yeah.
Right. And it was like transformative. I was sick of riding the subway after like 20 years growing up on the subway and being outside and moving around. And it was so, I loved it. Right. And then I would just keep destroying my jeans.
Right.
Like insanely fast. And I'd patch them up and like destroy. And I was like, this is just absurd, and I later learned as I got deeper into the industry that a lot of like the jeans that were really popular at the time were like not intentionally designed to like fall apart really quickly, but like they're designed to age really quickly, right? They're designed to like take on visual character really interesting, like the patina jeans, and that stuff's beautiful. I still love that stuff. And that was sort of the innovation. Like Levi's like had spent like literally 100 years working with their partner Cone Mills Denim, right? Like in North Carolina, like perfecting denim so that it didn't fade, that it didn't braid, right? Like and there's actually like this class of like motorcycle enthusiasts that I only met one of them. So I don't know how big it really is, but that absolutely like fetishizes this like particular, like the sort of end point of Levi's in like the mid 80s when they had like perfected a certain type of denim that was like basically indestructible. And then right at that point, like the people who love jeans decided they wanted to go the other way because, what they loved about the jeans was not that they were indestructible, but that they like took on character and aged, right? And so something like an APC went and like undid everything that Levi's like innovated to do. And like, we're like, no, let's gonna like reduce it back to the point where it's like a 1950s Levi's where like you wear it and it breaks in and like you get all these whiskers and lines and stuff. At that particular point, I was like wearing denim that was designed to fall apart essentially. And I was like, I need something better. And so I went shopping. And I figured I'd spend an afternoon and like find a pair of pants that was better than the jeans I was wearing, and that I could bike around the city and I could go to work. I was a freelance graphic designer, information designer. And, in that environment, some places you can wear anything you want and some places you have to look pretty professional, right? So, and I just wanted to be able to ride my bike to a client meeting, not really worry if it might rain a little bit. Obviously, you don't want to ride through a giant rainstorm to a client meeting, but like, light rain, 50% chance of rain, just really simple things, right? Just to move around the city. And I also didn't want to destroy my jeans. And so I went shopping and I was like, there's nothing here. And like, it took like a year of like looking and like being like, there's gotta be something better out there. And finally I was like, I guess I gotta learn how to make these things because I still wanted them and they didn't exist. So, but I had, found like interesting fabrics that people weren't using and like to make what I wanted, right? But were great. So I dove in. I started like just asking questions in the garment district, just wandering around. And, the garment district, I mean, I think this really well, is like this remnant of something that used to be gigantic, right? It was like 90% of the clothes in America used to come from the extended New York garment district, not just like Manhattan, but literally like just insane amounts of clothing coming from Manhattan and going across the country, which is mind-boggling to think about that. And there's still like a few $1 billion worth of clothes made in Manhattan every year.
Wow.
Right. And this is like literally basically Times Square, it's like
crazy.
So I dove in and it was fascinating. I was like, like doing these like really high-tech freelance projects like in Midtown and then walking across Midtown to the garment district. And it was like going from like the 21st century to the 19th century, right? But I loved it. It was super fun. And I fell in love with the technical materials. I was like, there's so much interesting stuff happening in this space. Just sort of spiraled from there. I had a really fortuitous like meeting with my business partner. Our coffee shop introduced us. They had 2 locations at the time. And like the barista was like, Abe, give me your email. There's this customer that goes to our other location. I'm going to see him this afternoon. Like she knew. She was like guaranteed he would come in for his like afternoon coffee. And he's doing exactly what you're doing. And he was like doing stuff with shirts.
Wow.
Same problem. He was like trying to bike over the bridge and he would like sweat through his shirt. And like he'd either have to change or, and he was like, this is stupid. It's like a 15-minute bike ride. But, the bridges are just high enough in New York that if you bike across them on a regular non-electric bike, you're going to sweat, So we met, we were like looking at the same materials. We were like trying to solve the same problem. So that was like the ignition right there. Like there were ideas that I'd spent a couple of years building. I had prototype pants. I had like a logo, all this different things. But as soon as I met Tyler, my partner, like kind of that was the ignition. And within like a couple months, we had a company and like a website and we were up and running.
And it just took off?
Yeah. I mean, we were like also really early to direct to consumer. You know,
Right.
There wasn't even a term at the time, but I had built these pants and I was like, oh, I got to figure out the math, you know? And I sat down and they were like, oh, these pants are going to be like $600 if I sell them to Barney's, right?
Right.
And I had never bought $600 pants that didn't come with a sport coat on top, you know? And so...
And that's because there are more layers that are adding their own margin.
Yeah, like, I mean, they're wholesale, you know, you're wholesaling to a retailer and they're marking it up, you know, almost 3x.
Right.
Right. So I was like, what happens? You know, I knew more about making websites than making clothes, right? So I was like, what happens if we put it online? And I wasn't the first. There were a couple other sort of predecessors out there. There was a company called Finisterre. It's still around. It's like a cold water surfing company in Cornwall, England. So that was like my main reference. They were kind of doing similar stuff. And yeah, I was like, let's do it. Like, let's just put these things online and see what happens because we can bring the price down dramatically. And that was sort of a false promise. But like a lot of people did it. Like the early wave of D2C like came right after us and like was built around this exact same premise, like cut out the middleman, right? And go online and you can bring the price down. And the reason why I say it's a false premise is because what people learned really quickly is that when you're online, nobody just walks into your store, right? So, and again, these are terms that didn't exist when we started, but like the customer acquisition cost, right, is quite high. And so like if you start a direct-to-consumer brand now, today, like the cost of buying the customer is basically the same as like what Barney's was marking it up back then, right? Like those differences have collapsed for the most part. Not 100%, but almost 100%. But we were early, so we got like the early adopters buy, right? You can't be too early, right? So it was right place, right time, right? We were able to put things up and customer acquisition costs, like maybe somewhere, someplace people were using the term, but I had never heard of it for years. Like we didn't think about it for years. We just put things online and talked to people. And we realized really quickly, like, and again, this is also something that's changed dramatically, is like there were all these blogs out there back then and they were thirsty for content, right? It was like a new thing that like they realized that like if they put up 12 posts a day or something, like a hype beast or whatever, like that would drive the traffic, right? And nobody was pitching them, right? They didn't have 12 pieces of content. It's insane now, right? Like Hypebeast probably gets like 12,000 like inbound email requests every day, right? For different brands pitching them with different stuff, right? But at that time we were just like, oh, if we take good photos, make interesting content, like people talk about us, people put us out there. So again, it was like, we were lucky, we were early, and we, you know, it was literally early to digital photography. Like the first photo shoots we did ourselves, right? And the digital cameras were just good enough that like we could pull it off and like make good enough photos. Like if we were like 3 or 4 years earlier, like we was, you know, literally would have needed to have a different camera setup and then it'd be a whole different story.
Were these people in New York that were buying them or were they all over?
Yeah, I mean, New York is still our biggest market, but it's not like dramatically the biggest market. Right. It was all over the world. In fact, early on, like the percentage of international customers was like really high. And there's still a lot of international customers, but the percentage goes down every year because like the people willing to take that leap, you know, it's expensive over, you know, like you got to go through customs. It's a risk. Like some places delivery is good, some places it sucks. So we still sell a lot internationally, but like as a percentage of our business, it gets smaller every year. The absolute number grows. So
right. It's curious to me because it feels like so much of the DNA of the company was New York oriented, or at least like the inspiration. But it seems like that's translated beyond.
Well, I mean, New York's something that's pretty sellable.
Yeah.
The world, I mean, I wouldn't say the world over. Like, there's obviously a lot of people that dislike it, but it's something that, people can latch onto that.
And is it mostly people in cities?
Yeah. Oh, it's very urban. There's no question. It's not 100%, obviously. And like our stuff is, it's interesting because we make really technical clothing on certain levels. So some of it's better for hiking than like traditional hiking gear or things like that. So there are like rural use cases and whatnot, but for the most part, it's, we're selling in cities all over the world.
I think one of the things that's special about Outlier is like the community. So for those who don't know, there's a very active Reddit or subreddit for the Outlier community.
And a Discord too.
And I'm not on the Discord.
Oh, the Discord's where the energy's at.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of energy on the Reddit. I feel like does it get crazy on the Discord?
Yeah, I mean, the Discord's just, it's a much faster paced environment than the Reddit, but it's, it generally feels healthier. Although it's like, there's a cycle. I've been through a lot of like watching communities like rise and fall online is something actually an interest of mine, right? So, not the first, but the first one I really saw a full cycle was this design community around the turn of the century, 2000, where we're called Dreamless. And it was just all sort of online graphic designers, and like there were just like some really serious kind of threads going on, and then there were like these like chaotic, like just full on like playing around, like early like proto meme type behavior and stuff like that. And then the artist named Joshua Davis, who's still quite active in digital space, but he would like get pissed off and like burn the place down every once in a while. Like, and there would be these like sort of like bacchanals where like literally like the users would like destroy the community, and then it would like be reborn, and then eventually shut it down. So that was a really interesting experience. Like, it made me really interested in like online communities, right? And so that's part of like how we grew. The very first year or two, was like kind of bike commuting, or not even commuting, like fixed gear. There was like a New York fixed gear forum that was kind of like where we kind of emerged from in a certain way. And then Reddit was wild accident. But again, like I had been thinking about communities for a long time, so it's not totally an accident. So it's interesting, like our first exposure to Reddit was kind of like a fake out, like somebody, like a friend of a friend. We didn't even really know this guy. Just was like trying to prove to somebody like that he could like get something onto the front of Reddit when it was like Reddit was big, but still like, small compared to what it is now. And so he got a pair of our shorts, with like, the right keywords or whatever headline. He got it to the top of Reddit, like front page of Reddit, and it drove insane amounts of traffic, but the traffic was worthless. Like the average, people would stay for, I forgot what it was, like 8 seconds, 12 seconds or something. So it's like, oh, all this traffic showed up and then just left. There was no joke, right? He like kind of had the clickbait, but he didn't have the deliverable. He didn't have like the joke at the end, right? And so people would show up on our site and be like, this is not funny, bye, right? But it woke us up. We're like, oh, this is crazy traffic. It was worthless traffic, but whatever. And then like the clothing side of Reddit started emerging, and we started seeing all this traffic like a year or two later. And we're like, wow, this is a lot of traffic. Where is it coming from? And you'd be like some Reddit thread, and then you'd like dig down like 300 comments and be like, this is coming from this buried comment, and it's driving like tons of people to our website. This is powerful. So we started like engaging. And one of the things we learned really, really early on is that like the tenor of the conversation changes dramatically when you enter it. It's like people talking behind your back versus people talking to you, right? So, and we saw that really quickly. We'd be like, oh, if we get in here and engage with people, like the tone changes. And so we're like, this is powerful. Let's play with it. And so we're like, what happens if we start our own Reddit? And we did. I think it's still called like an experimental space where it's just like us playing around. We're like, what happens? Let's see. And boom, like it was like, oh, all of a sudden we have this like community and we're active in it, right? So it's like, you can't just start a community and leave it, right? You have to like, build it, right? So there was like some fortuitous like coming together, and then we stayed around and we're like, all right, we're going to like provide content for this Reddit.
Do you think that there are certain categories that lend themselves towards these kind of communities more than others?
I mean, that's hard to say. As a blanket answer, I'd say no.
Yeah.
I think that people can nerd out about anything.
Yeah.
But obviously, like, they have different structures and different things. Like, there's other Reddits. And again, we were like one of the first clothing brands that had its own Reddit because we started our own, right? And then other people started ones. And like Supreme has a giant Reddit. They didn't start it. But the tenor is so different than ours, right? Because it's like, independent of the brand, and it's just a different scale and it's a different mindset, right? These are people like trying to flip products or like, collecting in certain ways. So, what works for different brands like shifts, right? So there's a lot of discords too, right? So certain brands like the discords, and there's less than Reddits, right? But, certain brands will have discords, whereas other brands like the discourse might stay on Instagram comments or something, right? Different mediums work differently for different kind of discussions, right? So the more visual it is, obviously, the more likely it's going to be on a place like Instagram or like Pinterest, or right? Whereas the more textual, right? And that was one of the interesting things when we started is, we make technical clothing. So like, one of the things I noticed when I was buying clothes is I love to I would read the tags, and there used to be like, it's less common now, but like big Gore-Tex tag or whatever, right? And I would be like, I would actually read it. I wouldn't just like tear it off. I would like sit there and read it. And so it's like, we try and make like a layer of textual information about our clothes, right? And so that immediately puts it like into a Reddit zone, because Reddit is pure text. There's almost no images there, right? Like there's links to images, but like it's basically a textual medium, and we're making clothes, but we're also providing a text layer that goes with the clothes. So that combination works on Reddit better than, a brand that's like entire, mode of operation is creating better prints or something, right?
Yeah, it's almost like there's a liner notes layer.
Yeah, exactly.
To the gear. And even on your website, it's quite editorial in a way. And you've got that email newsletter that you send out. Is it once a week?
Yeah, it varies, but yeah, we're roughly, probably average one a week.
But there's a lot of storytelling happening in that way.
Yeah, the email like is, designed like literally like it has a tone. I write the email, right? And
You do?
I do, yeah. It's still, it's like the one thing I have a hard time delegating is the copywriting.
Do you write the copy on the site?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's just like I have a particular style I like, and it's tricky, like to delegate things is hard sometimes, and sometimes it's really easy. If you hate doing it, it's easy to do it, right? But the copy, I just haven't. Every time I try to do it, I'm just like end up editing it so much I might as well have written it in the first part, so. When
you write, is it just you? Is that your natural way of writing, or are you embodying like a brand that's sort of somewhat distinct?
It's me. There's that line is pretty thin between me and my brand, I guess. So it's natural, but it is like it's a formula, right? It's like designed like a letter. Like I basically talk about the weather every time, and that's like a traditional like I think it's like a Japanese formula, like. But I'd seen it somewhere, but it's pretty like universal in certain ways.
What's the formula? So you talk about the weather.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Like it's an intro, you talk about the weather, and then I dive into whatever. Right, yeah, it's just like related to New York, but it's like, that first couple lines are a formula. And then, what's interesting about formulas is that they give you a space to like try and flip the formula too. It's always written in the first person and it goes out there. And yeah, we're just kind of trying to send you a letter from New York about what's going on, which includes the new products that we just.
Yeah, it's interesting how central New York is to the brand in that way. I'd be curious, like, when you have this community, I can imagine, like, you guys you're pushing the envelope constantly, but you have a community that might not be traveling as quickly or in the same direction because people joined at different points in the journey. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with a community that can sometimes be passionate and unruly and resistant to change?
I wish I had a really easy answer for this one. No, that's a challenge. And, I have to keep pushing. But our basic formula is that when we have a successful product, we want to just keep making it, right? And so as long as it sells, like, then we can just keep making the same things and, do new colors, or like every once in a while we tweak it. But once you have get like a product to kind of like, it's like iconic, like kind of locked in space, like a stable space where it's like there's nothing really obvious to improve, right? We just let it run. And it's great when you have that. The really tricky thing that's painful is when we have products that aren't actually successful but have like deep fan bases. That's where it gets brutal, because it's like, there's certain products that would just sit on our site and we'd sell some of them, but they were not profitable.
Is there an example of one that's like
the iconic one is the something we call the 60-30 chinos.
Okay.
And my joke now is that the name 60-30 is the year that we're going to bring them back. Right? But people love these things, and they were like, it was an amazing fabric that came from the equestrian world. That was a combination. It was cotton rich, like 60% cotton, 30% nylon, which had a durability and like 10% elastic, right? And it's a reference to something called 60-40 cloth, which is like an iconic like 1970s kind of outdoor fabric, right? Which is 60% nylon and 40% cotton. And this added the stretch. And so you had this like really durable chino with a lot of stretch, super comfortable, had a water repellent treatment, so it stayed clean. Really, really nice pant, but really expensive, right? Making this stuff is super expensive. And it sold well, but it like never quite got that like fully geared up and lift off, right? And so we stopped making it, and then we'd like bring it back because people would complain, and then it would sell well like the first week, and then sales would plummet, right? And it was like, so there's like this really passionate base that think it's the best stretch chino ever made or whatever, which might be true. But the problem is that it's super expensive, and there's lots of substitutes now. Like lots of brands like came in and copied this exact product, and maybe didn't get 100% of the way there, but they got 90, 95% of the way there at like half the cost, a quarter of the cost. So like it's just not a sustainable product anymore. But at the same time, yeah, maybe it was better than anything that came after it. Certainly in certain people's minds it is, but we just have to leave it behind, and people complain about it to this day. Like every few months, like somebody will show up on the Reddit and complain about it. Be like, how do I replace it? And yeah, there's no exact replacement, but you can go buy Dockers for like $60 that are like 90% there,
Wow.
Instead of us trying to sell it for $300. But I wish I could make these people happy, because it was a great product and they have a point, right? But that, you can't fight economics like forever.
Yeah.
You can like pick your little battles and like force it. But for the most part, we just like, we try and make things as long as they're profitable, maybe a little bit longer. And then we try and make new things. Like that's what's exciting to me, is like creating new stuff. So you just can't get too bogged down in it, even if people get really loud on Reddit about it.
Yeah. I feel like one of the cool things about you and what you built is it's kind of like this, you guys are a real business, right? Like, and you never raise capital, outside capital, as far as I know. But there's also this kind of like progressivism to it. And, I think it flies in the face of a lot of the like conventional wisdom about the political spectrum, actually. How do you think about this kind of like new school capitalism or the kind of capitalism that you do?
For me, like, I think what separates like how I approach this stuff from a lot of people is that I really try and separate markets from capital in like how I look at things. And, this is an oversimplification, but I'm basically like pro markets and in a plural, like not in a singular, and anti-capital. And again, this is an oversimplification, but like to me, like I think markets are amazing.
Yeah.
And when I talk about that, I'm like, it's literally like going to the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul or something. I love that energy, and I love seeing like the dynamics, and I love like how things are exchanging, right? And they're healthy and vibrant, and like new ideas come from these environments.
Yeah.
And they're super exciting. A market's just a place of exchange, and right? And I love that dynamic, and I fully embrace it. Like, so we're part of a global market, right? We're like sourcing things from all over the world. I travel around the world trying to find new materials. We make things all over the world, and then we sell things all over the world. But capital is very different, right? And a lot of times when people talk about capitalism, right, it's basically a conglomeration. It's like, capital plus markets together. But the fact is that they're often in tension with each other. They're often fighting with each other. Like capital, you'll have big capitalists out there talking about free markets, but that's only like when a capitalist talks about free markets, that's because they're locked out of something. And so they want it to be free. They want it to be open for them. But as soon as they're in the market, like they're going to be looking for like, a way to control the market in a certain way because they make more profit that way. Right. So, capital is always looking for the highest return. And if you think about capital as like kind of like a phase change operation, there's different stages of it. And so at the early stages, right, it can be like super productive, right? Like money going into building industry, right? Or creating new technologies or opening up new spaces of possibility, right? And so early stage capital like that is not that problematic. But if you look at how it operates, as soon as it gets like big and ossified, it gets pretty toxic. And so, we've never raised outside capital. We're basically like not a capital free entity. Like me and Tyler, my partner, put in a very small amount of money as capital to start this thing, but we're bootstrapped from there. And it gives us a lot of freedom in how we can operate because nobody's over our shoulder asking us for returns, right? And when everything's smooth and operating, like, if you raise money, taking capital, like it can be great, right? Like everything's in line, right? Like you have somebody who puts in money and you have something that you want to make. And then together, like you're generating something that people want to buy. And like now you have a really healthy running machine, right? The problem with that sort of structure is that it never runs straight forever, right? There's always going to be like, periods of economic stress, like times when things go south and like, it could be personal. It might, like if you raise money from a wealthy friend and all of a sudden like something happens and they're no longer wealthy, like they're going to deal with you differently, right? Because like what might have been like a fun, like, oh, here's some money to do something, like becomes like, oh man, I need that money back, right? And so, and the same thing, like when you raise money from a venture capital firm, right? And they just had a huge IPO with something else, they're like, oh yeah, we got free money, right? And then they've had a couple bad years and their people who invested in them are like, where's our returns, right? All of a sudden they're going to start looking at things differently as well. So, so capital is like kind of a dangerous thing, right? Where it can work really well at certain phases and then it can turn against you and become like quite problematic, particularly when like you have giant firms that are kind of run their course and like need to figure out how to like increase profits, even though like there's no real obvious healthy way to increase profits. And so then they start looking at unhealthy ways to increase profits. And that's sort of where you get the darker side of things going in there.
Imagine listening to a podcast and not hearing an ad for a website builder. You'd be like, what kind of podcast is this? We know you need your fix, and we're not going to deprive you of that. At Universe, we believe websites are the main event, so of course we'd sandwich one in between our show. Here's the deal. Websites are dope, everyone needs one, and they can actually be fun to build and have some personality behind them. This is the part of the ad where I rattle off a list of all the things our website building product can do for you in hopes that you choose Universe over the competition. Create sites, build stores, analytics, email shipping off from your phone feels like playing with Legos, all that good stuff. We got it. I mean, you can make sites so good you'll shit yourself, but that's just brass tacks. At Universe, a website is so much more than just something you hear about on a podcast commercial. It's an extension of self. It's a way to interact creatively with the digital world. And we're hell-bent on helping the internet live up to its full potential. A more eclectic, more electric place. Because the internet shouldn't just be a space for squares. Grab a domain like .xyz and show those .com boomers what the internet's all about. Head to Universe. That's univer.se, but the dot is silent. Punch those puppies into the App Store, my friend, and we'll see you out there.
Well, I like this uncoupling of markets and capitalism. I think that's really right. There's also different kinds of capital, right? Like you haven't taken outside capital, but you've created capital. I mean, Outlier has capital now. And, you guys, I would imagine, have thus built it, and you can use it. That's why you could be more ambitious in the things that you create, because you've got that. So I guess like how much of what you're saying is specifically around like outside capital versus just the nature of capital itself?
There's different definitions of capital out there. It's a fuzzy term, right? So you can throw it around. The simplest one to look at is simply like capital is money that is invested with the purpose of returning more money, right? And that's from Marx, right? It's like money into commodities into money prime, right? And from that standpoint, I like that definition. It's really interesting to me because it's like a virtual distinction between capital and money, but it's very real, right? Like, why is one piece of money this money and one piece capital, right? Like, there's no actual physical distinction. They're all just dollars or pounds or whatever, right? Euros. But as soon as you have this psychological demand on there, right? Like, this is money with a purpose of returning more money. That's sort of the distinction. So when we reinvest our profits, like, in some ways it's capital, but it's not actually like, our goal is not to make more money by investing it. It's to make more products. And the money is like something that we need to make in order to do that, right? So like there's like, Tim O'Reilly has this sort of metaphor that he talks about, like where you look at like, money, if you look at like building a company as like a road trip, right? Money's like the gas you got to put 100%. In the engine, right? And so, but the point of the road trip is not to like put as much gas into the engine as possible, right? And have it spill out onto the road or whatever, right? It's like the point of you can't run out of gas. You run out of gas, like, you can run out of gas once and have an adventure, but like you can't just completely run out of gas, right? You want to do a road trip, you got to keep putting gas into that car. You got to figure out where that comes from. And so it's the same thing. Like the point of the journey of the company is to build really interesting products and like, have fun and like, provide people's livelihoods, right? And that takes money, right? But we never think about it as like, oh, we need to make more money because for the sake of it.
It's like there's that book, Finite and Infinite Games by James Carson, basically breaks down this idea that there's really two kinds of games. There are finite games where the purpose is to win, and winning means that the other person loses. And then there are infinite games where the purpose is to keep playing. And I think of business in the way that you're describing it as an infinite game. You want to keep playing the game.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's the same thing in game theory too, right? Like really basic game theory, like people use these like, sort of basic setups that like the weird early game theorists were kind of like using to like justify nuclear war and weird shit. But as soon as like they started like trying to like synchronize the game theory so that it was not just one game, but like multiple games, all of a sudden like cooperation became like a much more viable strategy. In fact, like probably the winning strategy, right? So if it's like your prisoner's dilemma, right, is a classic like game theory thing. And if you play it once, like it kind of rewards you for being like the asshole, like being uncooperative, right? But if you play it like over and over and over again, like it rewards you for like cooperating with people because
it becomes an iterated game.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's the whole thing is that we're in a networked world. There's 8 billion people and we're connected to all of them in some way, right? Some of them quite distantly, right? But, a lot of them very, very intimately, whether we like live with them or work with them or live next to them or cross them on the street, right? Or, so buy something from them, right? There's a huge chain of connecting us. Like, and if I buy a fabric from Japan, right? There's like workers in Japan that are running those machines and dyeing the fabric, right? And then the yarns might be coming from, 2 or 3 other places and there's workers there and they have families, right? So these networks spread out like, throughout the whole world. We're all kind of in this together.
Yeah. Why do you think so? We've had markets forever in human history, or at least for the last 10,000 years. And they're ancient. Like in the Bible, there's markets and things like this. But the explosion we've seen in quality of life, let's say, or GDP per capita has really happened over the past like 150 years. I'm curious how you think about that. Because to me, like, markets without capitalism feels like this sort of pre-industrial revolution moment.
I think, it's interesting like that. Like the more like contemporary like ideas around capitalism actually show that it's been around for thousands of years too. And it has different phases, right? It kind of like has these big moments, right? So if you like look at like ancient Sumeria, like there's periods of that history where like there was pretty much functional capitalism happening at those periods too. And there's also like relatively defined arcs where like this sort of like early phase like capitalism like provokes a lot of growth and then like it can cap out and stagnate. There's, some theorizing around like sort of a shift where there's a point where like, investing in something really physical and real is like the best way to get a return. And that at a certain point, like those returns kind of start diminishing but there's a lot of money circulating. And that's where you get the kind of like speculative level where it's like, there's more money in real estate or in like selling derivatives, right? Yeah. Like, and you kind of, that's where the house of cards starts to like get built and then like things kind of stagnate because nobody's actually investing in building real things anymore.
I agree with that. Yeah. And I'm not sure like that sort of financialization of the economy. I'm not sure if we're at a moment where that's about to go supernova, where it's all at the financial layer, or if it's actually swinging back towards the real world. What do you think?
I mean, it's like what I think is interesting is how global it is, right? So you kind of have different shifts throughout the world. And so if you look at like the UK right now, like they look like they're in a pretty economically stagnant zone, right? Because they really, really pushed like to like send everything offshore, right? And sort of virtualize everything. And they pushed it super hard and they made lots of profits and they're kind of a hollow shell, right? And it's not like there's no industry left there. There's still some fabric you can buy from the UK and they still make cars, right? And they still have...
But even like Land Rovers are mostly made in Slovenia, like...
Oh, yeah, Land Rover's an Indian company, right? No. Taha, right? No, they pushed really, really hard to like offshore everything and extract a lot of money in the short term, right? And it's interesting because that strategy, and short term isn't like a day, right? It's like years in this kind of scheme, right? And it's super profitable, like they're, high quality of life and whatnot. But it, in the end, like how sustainable is it? Can you have like a pure financial economy, right? And in the end, it seems unlikely that it's fully sustainable because at the end of the day, people are going to, who own the means of production, like are going to be like, well, actually, we don't need your financing anymore.
Right.
Like we have our own, right? We can build our own layers of this stuff. And then there's nothing left, right? So, but it's tricky because there's so many layers and they're interoperating on so many different levels. And, economy like the US is much more industrial than you might think, right? Like it feels on certain levels like it's all just tech and, finance. But the fact is that there's still tons of factories and tons of manufacturing and tons of things happening. So I think the tricky thing is the balance, right? It's like, how do you, it's like the right mix of nutrients that are going into your body. I think about this in terms of food now, actually, honestly, right? Because it's like, like when we grew up, like, I don't remember from school, they give you like this food pyramid or something that seems like utterly like when you read about food these days, like the food pyramid seems like this like antiquated, like totally wrong, made up thing. And there were certain aspects of it that literally were like kind of pushed by certain industries. It was like dairy industry was like the milk section's not big enough, like make that bigger on the pyramid or whatever. Right. But I think what's interesting about it, that whole thinking like that differs from the way like people think about food a lot nowadays, is it was based on being balanced. And even if there was like certain unbalances that might have been forced in there or whatnot, it was actually about, let's make a balanced diet. You eat like some of this and some of that and like bring it all together in like a healthy whole. Whereas like now you have like food trends that are like eat nothing but raw eggs, right? And they might like produce short-term results, right? Because you're doing weird body hacks and nutrient hacks and whatnot, but they don't like create a healthy, sustainable like way to live your life every day for like, decades, right? So
that's cool. I mean, that's, I never really thought of the food pyramid as actually like a way of mainstreaming nuance, right? Because what we're talking about is, I feel like we're stuck in a culture right now that lacks nuance. And that's, we'll call it because of technology or whatever, but like everything becomes black or white. And even something like the food pyramid, which was so crude and wrong in some ways, at least it was a structure, a framework that had inherent nuance.
Yeah. There's a lot of flexibility in it, right? And it's a guide to sort of like help you know that like, oh, you're out of balance, right? As opposed to like, right now it's like, oh yeah, a lot of the food structures that like kind of get pushed are like about like pushing you to like this dynamic edge, right? It's like, oh, you want to be like 0% body fat, like eat nothing but raw eggs and meat, right? Or like you have like, oh, vegan, right? There's another side to it, right? Where you're like drawing these forced lines, and there's certain ethics to why they're doing it, obviously, but like you're also kind of cutting out like huge amounts of nutrients. So yeah, I think it's, the key thing is like, how do you keep things in balance? Like think about that and like figuring out when sometimes you want to go to the edge, right? When do you want to be at maximum performance, push things to a limit? When do you want to pull back and be like, oh no, let's like relax. Let's like, take a day off. Let's like bring in a different type of nutrient, right? Like how do you keep things moving healthily, right?
And you're saying like when we think about the economy, we could imagine that kind of structure where you have some financial parts, but it's not all that.
Yeah, exactly. It's like if you go to a pure financial economy, like, there's a theory you could be like, yeah, we're just the financiers and that's all we do. Right. It's like we put money to work and that's the entire country, right? And we're a super rich country, right? And that's kind of like what the UK, an exaggerated version of what the UK tried to do, right?
Yeah.
And part of that was like, let's take all our factory assets and move them to countries where the labor's cheaper, right?
Yeah.
And so now you have like very obvious like dynamic imbalance all of a sudden, right? You have like a country where like labor is really high and a country where labor is really low, and like moving some of like the demand to the low cost labor country helps even it out a little bit, but by extracting huge amounts of profits from the top, it pushes it the other way in a financialized country, right? So, and then you have like people who want to get to the rich country because that's where the money is, right? And then you have people who are in the rich country like being like, let's drop the gates because I want to like, sit on this money, right? And it doesn't seem like the healthiest balance to me. Yeah. It's like you need to figure out how to like circulate it a little bit more and like have more of that cash flowing to more people, right? On a worldwide level and also inside the country, right? So,
yeah. So, I mean, I think on that note, like, I'm curious how you think about production and, how you guys make your clothes.
I mean, we make them in factories. It's pretty straightforward, but it's interesting. We still make a lot of stuff in New York. I shouldn't say a lot in terms of like, like the new small production stuff gets made in New York. You can't make big scale stuff in New York anymore. So, we were born in the New York Garment District. We still do small runs in the New York Garment District. So we do a lot of like what we call experiments. Like we're just playing around, testing new ideas out. And that's generally done through New York. And then there's certain things that we can scale to a certain extent in New York. But for the most part, like, we outgrow Manhattan pretty quickly. And these are like very like flexible, but chaotic and disorganized factories, essentially. Like very creative spaces, but like they're not big and they're not organized the way you can when you have a lot of space for a factory, right? So the next stage is to move it elsewhere, which usually, in our case, we mostly move stuff to Portugal and Thailand. And those are our two favorite places right now because they're kind of like in the sweet spot where like the labor conditions are good, the quality is high, the price is good. These sweet spots don't stay sweet forever, right? So it's kind of crazy. Like we buy textiles from Switzerland, like one of our really early partners, Shoulder Textile. They turned 150 a few years ago. So I went to this whole party they did in Switzerland. And their founder wasn't Swiss. Their founder was German. And he moved to Switzerland for cheap labor.
Wow.
It like literally was like Switzerland was like where the labor was cheap and like crazy. But if you think about it, like made in Italy used to be cheap labor, made in Japan used to be cheap labor, right? So, you know, we see like Portugal and Thailand as being like in that sweet spot right now.
Yeah.
Where you can get like a really good value, but like people are getting paid well and getting treated right. And the quality is really high. So that's where we're at, and it'll shift. Hopefully, you know, like it's not great as a business, but like hopefully it gets to a point where made in Portugal is like expensive, like made in Italy is expensive, and certain things, you know, will still get made there, but like there'll be someplace else that like is like using that ramp, right? And so I don't want to say it's like a universal tendency, but like if you look at New York City garment district, like the garment industry was always like a ramp up for different cultures and communities, right? It started, or initially it was super Jewish, right? It started in the Lower East Side, right? People like sewing, you know, and it's, you know, the reason New York was the center of the garment industry was because it's where Singer sewing machines was based. And Singer was like Singer was a conglomerate of like a bunch of different sewing machine patents, right? And the Singer name, like you know, he was just one of like a bunch of inventors, but he happened to be like a former actor who was like better at selling these things than other people. But yeah, like people were like, oh, you could buy a sewing machine and then you could start a factory in your house, literally.
Wow.
You know,
the personal sewing machine, like the personal computer.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, exactly. It was like this new technology that you can invest in that could like open up the possibility space, right? You could sew garments like 10 times faster, 100 times faster, whatever it is, right? If you go to the garment district now, there's like still a few Jewish factory owners or like fabric store owners left, but it's not a Jewish place at all, right? It's like Chinese and Dominican and Korean. And these are all cultures that like came into New York and found the garment industry as a ramp to grow up. And like, if you go to a factory now, like you'll see a lot of like 50-year-old Chinese ladies sewing stuff, but their daughters and sons are not working in the garment industry. You know, they're doctors and lawyers and so when it works like that, it's fantastic, you know? And so that's like kind of the
and that's happening for countries too, is what you're saying.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, Japan, right, was cheap labor in a certain point. You know, like Sony changed it, I think, right? But like if you talk to people of a certain age, like made in Japan in 1960 was cheap, right? And now it's like the total opposite. We're like, oh, Japanese clothing, like it's super expensive, fetishized thing, right? And same with Italy, same thing. But it's tricky on a country level, like how far it goes. Like it's hard to say, right? But there's certain indications it's happening in China, right? And but again, these are giant. Like China in particular is gigantic, so it's hard to say 100% if this like dynamic is complete or not.
Yeah. Do you think that we'll have robots making clothes anytime soon?
That's a really, really tough question.
Yeah.
People are obviously trying to do it.
It's weirdly hard.
It's insanely hard. And it's interesting because I go to this trade fair, it's called Tech Textile. It's one of my favorite fairs. It only happens every 2 years in Frankfurt. There's one in the US that's like much smaller. That happens every year. But the Frankfurt one is every 2 years. It's actually technically a sister fair. I go to Tech Textile to buy textiles, but there's this one called Tex Process that they basically hold them together. And they always have the new machines there. So I always walk through and see. And they've been presenting robot type stuff since I've been going. But what's interesting is that the robots actually get less and less ambitious every time I go. Every 2 years, there'll be like the new robot sewing machine and it does less than the one before. And they never work. There's always just technicians hanging around, like trying to fix them. And it's crazy. But in theory, it's like one of those things that should be solvable with brute force. Like the reason it's so hard is that when a human is putting fabric through a sewing machine, they're making like tons of micro adjustments.
Yeah.
Fabric is like a very dynamic, thing. It's constantly moving and shifting, and the human hand and eye is capable of making these like millions and millions of like kind of micro adjustments to create a straight line. And when you have a machine trying to do it, like the reflexes aren't necessarily there, and the processing's intense. It's like tracking the fabric and like watching it shift and like trying to stabilize it. And so those machines, like, it's like in theory a solvable problem, but nobody knows when. It's like at some point, like in theory, they crack through to the other side and like it becomes totally solvable. But I haven't seen it work yet. And then there's another approach I saw that like I haven't read why it disappeared, but it clearly failed. But where they were kind of doing the opposite, where they were like coating the fabric with like a stiff substrate, so it become more like cardboard. And then it was a really crazy setup. It was like an air hockey table. It would like shoot the things across, like they were controlling like where the air jets were, and it would like shoot the stuff like from like machine to machine on this big table, and like in theory make this whole setup. And Adidas invested like a whole bunch, and they had this whole press release, like, I don't know, maybe less than 10 years ago. They're like, we're going to build this factory of the future in like Arkansas or someplace. And like, we're going to make 1 million t-shirts a year here. And like using this technology. And then they just kind of like, that was the loud press release. And they had the quiet press release where like, we're closing this factory. Right. So I don't know what happened exactly. I haven't seen like the tell all, but, it's a challenge. It's a super challenge. And it's really crazy. Like, there's massive amounts of clothes sold every year, like billions of clothes made every year. Yeah. And every single one of them, except for socks, basically, sweaters, I guess, to a certain extent. But everything else is like sewn by humans.
By hand, yeah.
Yeah. Like sometimes they're cut by machines, sometimes they're cut by humans, but they're all just sewn together.
Crazy.
The socks are wild. The socks pretty much come out of the machine like one shot.
Wow. Is it like a knitting machine?
Yeah, it's a knitting machine. It's really crazy because there's another fair that's every 4 years that I go to that those machines are. And, they have all these crazy looms and different machines. The sock manufacturing people, the sock machine people are the only ones that like have like strong, like no camera type security around this stuff. And it's crazy because you look at these machines and like, I couldn't make heads or tails about what they're going. They're insanely complicated.
Wow.
But they're like no cameras, like no way. Like nobody's going to see the secret of our sock machine.
It's interesting because a lot of socks are still made in the U.S. or some socks. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's because, for this exact reason, like there's no labor. What's interesting is we actually were making socks that people love that we stopped making.
I know. I'm very disappointed about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And, what's interesting is that the real problem was not making them in the U.S. The problem was quality control in the U.S.
Wow, because that has labor.
And so it's like the socks would come out perfect, but then there'd be like 100 of whatever was on the machine before our, like totally different material or whatever. And we're like, then we had to, so we just got sick of doing quality control on this stuff. We'd have to do every sock because there might be 50 of the wrong sock in there, or like the, 50 that were labeled large when they're really medium, right?
Wow.
But otherwise, like socks in the US, it's just, all you got to do is buy a machine, and the only labor is like connecting the yarns to the machine and you turn it on.
So it's worth saying a lot of fabrics are made by machine, right?
Yeah. The fabrics are all extremely mechanical processes. Like, you need human monitoring it. There's some quality control going on. But you can have giant factories making fabrics with very few humans in them.
So it's really just the assembly of pieces of fabric.
Yeah.
That's the hard part.
Yeah. It's like cutting the fabric and then sewing it together in a line that feels like a straight line.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It's also one of those things where the pressure is not only that it's technically difficult, but when you have cheap labor available, you're competing with, cheap labor to make a t-shirt. It's like not expensive to make a t-shirt. So the market forces on building that machine are not as intense as it would be if there were no alternative.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a fair point. It's an interesting challenge. And it employs, there's obviously like bad situations, sweatshops where people are like treated really poorly, and like you need to avoid that. And, that's why we try and stay in countries like Portugal or Thailand where like labor standards are higher, and we can, we visit every single factory we work with and things like that. Right. But there's plenty of companies that are chasing the cheapest needle. Right. And that means pushing into like weird, dubious situations, but hopefully like, again, like, Bangladesh like has a massive garment industry, and hopefully like they can take that and build that into a healthier economy, right? Like step by step, where the kids grow up and like, somebody sewing is going to put them through college, and then they're going to go do something else. Right?
How do you guys find new materials?
I'm always hunting. So it's mostly through trade fairs. Right. So, and it's kind of like, I like to go all over the world. I mean, COVID like put a hiccup on that, but kind of back in stride, although I haven't been pushing the limits, I'm back into like regular stride, but like I always, pre-COVID, I'd always try and go to like one new and different fair a year. So I have certain places I go like see my suppliers and see what they have that's new. Right. So there's fashion side, like there's a fair called Premier Vision in Paris I go to twice a year. That's like the high fashion one. And then there's like one in Milan that's like kind of the same thing. Although it's interesting, post-COVID, they've kind of split a little bit. They used to be like 90% the same, and now they're kind of like regionalized again, which is a little scary. Well, the Italians don't want to go to France, and the French don't want to go to Italy, which I don't like. But it is, then there's like the outdoor industry ones, right? So, which I love. And the dynamics there are a little weird. The fairs are changing, but like there's always the outdoor industry, and like we source tons from that.
Yeah, what do you mean by the dynamics being weird?
It's just like, so there used to be there still is a show called Outdoor Retailer. That's kind of like used to be our secret sauce. Like we used to go to Outdoor Retailer and buy outdoor fabrics and make urban clothing, right? That was like the formula right there. Yeah. But Outdoor Retailer, it's mostly a trade show for retailers for selling like the actual clothes, but like a third of the show was actually sourcing, like the back of it. And then there's been just a lot of like annoying, boring drama with that show. It's not as fun as it used to be. And a lot of the suppliers just sort of went to a separate supply only show, which I'm going to go to in a few weeks actually, called Functional Fabric Fair in the US. And there's a European version, same company, called Performance Days. So if you want to like find like outdoor industry technical fabrics, that's where you go. Functional Fabric Days, Functional Fabric Fair in Portland, and Performance Days in Munich. And so if anybody wants to start competing with me, that's it. No gatekeeping. You just go find some fabric, and that's it. Right.
So you go there and you're like feeling stuff, and you're like, this would be great for a pant.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that was sort of the secret. Like when it was like the first days at Outdoor Retailer, when I was going, was like I would go to this outdoor fair, and then I would do what's called like the old school garmentos called like shop by hand. Like it's very touch oriented, just like touch and feel. And like, so like most people in the like outdoor industry like are shopping by spec. They're like, I need something that like meets this specification, and then obviously they're going to touch it and feel it at some point. But that's not like their instinct. I like very much touch oriented. It's like, how does it feel? And then figure everything else from there. But then I love to like go to surprising places, like go to, find something from the equestrian industry or from, firefighter or whatever it is. Right. So I'm always looking for new zones to like explore. And sometimes, if you go to a trade fair that you're unfamiliar with, and like 99% of it is irrelevant to you, but you find one thing that like you wouldn't have found otherwise, it's worth it. Right. So it's panning for gold kind of thing. And again, like COVID really like stopped that process, but I think we're at a point where I can get back into it. So,
yeah. What was COVID like for you?
I mean, it sucked.
Yeah.
I mean, it was kind of crazy because, it was survival at first. We didn't know if our warehouse was going to shut down, right? At first. So it was just like, just optimize for cash, right? And again, we're bootstrapped, right? So we don't have like, there's trade-offs to that. There's a lot of things I love about it, but like we're not sitting on like reserves that like somebody gave us like in exchange for equity, right? So it was just like day by day, like, you know, how do we get as much cash in the bank to like get through this? Because we didn't know how long it was going to last and how, you know, if we could keep selling things and stuff like that. So, and then when the factories were reopened, all this kind of stuff. So it's like piece by piece. But then like, you know, the PPP started happening and stuff and things like stabilized. And it was like, oh, well. But, you know, the clothing dynamics changed a lot. Like some people were like, oh, your online business, like online sales are up. Like it should be great. But it was like, no, like, you know, we're a pants business first and foremost. Half of our sales are pants, right? And nobody needed pants anymore. Yeah. Like they're on a Zoom call and it's like, that's it. Like no pants.
They certainly didn't need outdoor.
Yeah, no, they don't need like hard pants, right? People, and we didn't make soft pants. We made hard pants. Yeah. So that part sucked. And it's still annoying because all our projection numbers are like, you know, we had like, and there weren't amazing systems, but there were, you know, real systems in place for like projecting growth. Like how many pants do we need this month, right? And those numbers are still just like the data is a mess, right? Wow. It's like you're like, the data tells you something, but it's like that just because of COVID or is that because of, and then there's like the supply chain hiccups after COVID, right? So it's like we ran out of things because factories are closed, right? And everything's slower now. But at the same time, as soon as like the PPP kicked in, like the sting kind of got taken out of it, right? So it was like, there's a lot of frustrating, annoying things. And then there was like, oh, here's like, you know, free money from the government to keep people employed, literally, right? You know, it is what it is. It wasn't fun. And we're still like, you know, things are still not moving at the pace that they were before. Yeah. Like the supply chain is significantly slower. Wow. Like maybe 50 is probably a good number. It's like it can be like sometimes things move faster, right? So it's a wide variance, but like, you know, we used to order things like, you know, 5-6 months out. And now we're like, you know, 8-9 months out, which is really annoying because like you kind of like don't always see, you know, fashion's seasonal, right? Clothing's seasonal. And like when you're 6 months out, you get to see like all the sales from the last season before you put the order for the next season, right? And now we're like kind of in the middle of one season, like trying to order for the next year, right? So
does that make you more conservative?
On certain levels, yeah, definitely.
So one of the things I noticed, and I don't know how tracked this was to COVID, but you guys, you took a really interesting new direction. You're a menswear company, but your creative director is a transgender woman. And I've also noticed that show up in the work. There's an autobiographical component to the more runway side of things. Talk to me a little bit about that. And I say this, by the way, as a huge fan of Willie Norris, who's the creative director.
You know, Willie's amazing. So it's interesting. I mean, I can't speak too much to it because it's really her story. But, you know, Willie had worked for us for like 6-7 years. And so there's two sort of sides to it. Like the really sort of technical thing is like we had basically two essentially design directors up until like a few months before COVID, like beginning in January 2020. It was Willie and this woman, Jasmine Planton, who was amazing. And she got recruited by Nike January 2020. And so she left. And they're both like people that we had hired very young, like without much extensive previous experience, like designing and stuff, and both super, super talented. One of the things that happened is like when Jasmine left, like instead of hiring like a second like like person on the same level, we just like made Willie the design director. And that had a much more of an impact than we realized. Like we like having that sort of dual two creatives like in charge at equal level was more detrimental than we realized. They both were super talented, but like they both kind of deserved to be the one and like have more. It's weird. It's not even freedom. It's just more it's power, really, like more like control over the entire domain. Right. Yeah. So like having Willie in charge of the whole collection had a much bigger impact than we realized. And so, you know, let her vision become clearer. Right. And then the second side of it is like she transitioned during COVID, really. So, and that's like her journey. So I can't speak too much to it, but she's quite happy with the path. That, she took a lot of realizations on her part, right, to get there, right? So it's been amazing to watch because, she seems, she's thriving.
How do you think about it, though, from the perspective of the brand? And I mean, specifically, like, to me, it's really cool that the photo shoots that you guys run now, they're gender bending. Like, they're not what I would have expected. But I'd imagine that, like, you probably get some pushback from the community or whatever it is. And how do you think about that? And how do you, right? Because I'm curious how you manage a relationship with a creative director for a brand that, you own.
So in terms of pushback, we've actually gotten surprisingly little. And I think we're just really upfront about who we are. And we've always try and put a lot of diversity into our images, right?
Yeah.
New York is core to our brand, and we always want to represent that melting pot aspect of it. And so we always put that out there, and I think that helps, right? Every once in a while you see it in the Reddit or something, some people who complain on some level, but it's pretty rare. And so that's cool. And I think it's just the type of people that we try and attract and the image that we put out. In terms of the gender fluidity,
right?
It's interesting because it actually, to me, it goes beyond just working with Willie. I mean, she's amazing, but I see a lot of music too. There's a lot of the interesting musicians that are doing interesting stuff that are trans musicians in a lot of ways. So I love this artist, Rose or R Rose, electronic music, and she's amazing. And I think Arca is a huge example. Yeah. There was Sophie who died, unfortunately. And I think that people that do this sort of gender transition are just a little more open to the power of transformation in this world, right? That they understand that what it's like to start in one place that you don't really feel comfortable and move to another place and unlock the potential. Another one that's interesting in the same space, I actually just got her most recent book, is Mackenzie Wark, who's academic at the New School. And she has a book on raving. I haven't read it, but it's another interesting space. So I think that there's something about having gone through that little transition experience that opens people up in a way that a lot of people right now are having trouble with, right? We're in an age where progress is problematized, right?
Yeah.
For good reason, right? So as you grow up, if you look at climate change, right? You literally we're seeing the negative effects of years of progress, right? And our lifespans are still dramatically higher, right? All these things that we still want to use iPhones. We still want to use antibiotics, right? We live 30, 40 years longer on average than our ancestors did 100 years ago, right? So there's lots of progress out there, but we're seeing all the downside coming. Right. And so it makes it hard. And I think when you go through something like a gender transition, it makes it a little easier to be to understand that the power of the transformation.
Yeah. I mean, that resonates to me. I've always been a fan of transhumanism as just an idea of transcending the limits of our biology and technology and the tech industry. It comes from that utopian place in so many ways. It's about sort of extending our minds and not being tied to a fixed idea of what we're capable of doing. And I think that oftentimes in the discussions about us as people and the more political aspects, it's thought of through this sort of problematization lens that you talk about. It's a person's born this way or something like that, as opposed to saying, no, everything's possible. And I think that's really interesting. I wonder how we shift the zeitgeist more towards an openness in that way.
I think what's missing right now, which is easier to say than to do, is some sort of theory of nonlinear progress, right? So when we talk about progress, we think about it usually in this sort of linear stage, right? One step after another. And that's what's problematized right now, right? When you look at, we put engines in everything and now the world's getting hotter, right? It's makes it hard to think about just linear step by step, because we're in this sort of zone where the downsides are looking as big as the upsides, right? So it's how do you create a nonlinear theory of progress where we can look at how do we sort out the good from the bad? How do we not dive too quickly into things that end up hurting us, right? Like there's sort of like a history of rushing into technology a little too fast and then getting like blindsided by the whiplash, right? And it's tricky. And it's something I, like on a very small scale, try to build into our brand and our process where we experiment small and like try and test things out on small levels before we scale. But on a larger level, like we don't have those structures like fully built, right? Like the way to sandbox things, right? Like in coding, right? You can build like structures where you can test new ideas that are like cut off from like the larger code base, right? But as a culture, we don't have it. We have little pieces of it, right? There are elements of it, but it's not integrated into our culture. There's not like a deep understanding that like the new thing might be cool, but like maybe it should be sandboxed until we understand what the longer ramifications are. So AI right now is a huge example, right? People are like either diving in or terrified of it. But the truth is we just don't know what 10 years of AI does, right? Because we haven't had 10 years of this level of AI. We've had 10 weeks of it, right? Or whatever. So when you think about chemicals, right? You think about internal combustion engines, right? It's like you can understand what they're doing right now and what the short-term consequences are. And then like when you talk about internal combustion engine, like a giant infrastructure was built around it, right? So people understood what the like 5-10 year consequences were, 20, 30 year, like building houses, right? Like building roads, right? It's a massive amount of thought. And then now we're dealing on like the 100-year consequences, like what happens when we burn huge amounts of fuel, like and pump it into the air, right? And there were certain warning signs, but ultimately like we just rushed in like faster than we probably should have, right? Into implementing this technology in this giant way. And it enabled a lot of amazing things. I mean, we were talking about the outdoor industry before, like the entire outdoor industry is built off a car, like it doesn't exist without it, right? Obviously you could get into the outdoors before, but it was hard, right? It was like a different commitment. Now you can jump in a car and be hiking, right? So it's tough, right? It's like, how do you separate the risks? Well, not even the risks, like it's like the unforeseen consequences. Like how do you prepare yourself for that while also moving forward?
What's exciting you these days about the future?
To me, like what's exciting about the future is like the change in the literacy. It's like you have literacy, like how do you read? Like how do you understand a book? Like what arguments are the authors making, right? And, that's pretty pervasive through culture. Some people are better at it than others. But now you have like media literacy. And I love like, if you look at TikTok, you have a generation coming up that's so media literate that understands how to edit video, right? How that cut, like they understand in a way that like people my age, like unless they're like deep in the industry, like don't understand, right? And then you just have random 12-year-old kids or like Northwest, right? Like she's so TikTok literate, right? She's like 10 years old. And obviously she grew up with famous parents and around this stuff, but you can tell just like looking at what she makes that she like understands how to put together content better than most 40-year-olds, right? So that's super exciting. And then we're going to have like another layer, like algorithmic literacy is like the next phase, right? Where like, a lot of people freak out about algorithms, but algorithms are everything. Even when people like freak out, if people like, oh, I hate like the Twitter algorithmic feed, I like the chronological. Well, the chronological is just another algorithm, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's just that it's a little more, you're literate. You understand like the chronological is like, you're literate enough to understand the chronological and not literate enough to understand like the non-chronological. But kids growing up these days, I think, are going to be like super algorithmic literate. They're going to understand it and like know it and be able to play with it and like push it in ways that'll be really interesting, exciting. And so that's super exciting. I don't know, the future, that the best part of the future is that you don't know what it's going to be like.
Yeah.
So there's risks involved, but like I'm most excited for getting surprised.
Yeah.
Some kid coming up with something new that I've never thought of. I never thought of that way. Like, now that's exciting to the future. Like, that's what I love about it, is like things that push me out of my comfort zone and teach me new things.
I think that's a good place to end. Is there anything else you'd like to say or ask?
No, I think that's good. That was super interesting.
Cool. Abe, thanks so much. This was enlivening, and I think we could go on for hours, but we're going to call it here for this one.
All right. Well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Cool. It was amazing.
Thanks for listening to Internet Misfits. I hope you found the conversation inspiring, helpful, energizing, and insightful. You can find me on the web to continue the conversation on my personal site, joe.universe, which is joe.univer.se. See you out there. Bye-bye.